Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I created this severed hand prop. I originally made it to be a tree topper in the theme and spirit of Christmas. But if you need a silicone hand prop for movies or pranks or just for a nice little decoration for your home, this video will go over how I made it. Now this is more of an intermediate tutorial because it is using silicone, which is an expensive but long-lasting and very realistic material, and you need some professional equipment like an airbrush, a compressor to go with the airbrush, and a respirator. It also has some hazardous chemicals, so lighter fluid, also known as naptha or Shellite, which is why you need the respirator so that you do not poison yourself while making this. It also takes a lot of patience and practice to get realistic skin tones. The first silicone face that I painted about a year ago is just really not that great. So it's taken me about a year of practice to get more realistic with my painting, and it's also a very different way of painting from fine art painting. So I was trained as a fine artist. I went through university and I've studied painting, and painting with acrylics or oil paints on canvas is completely different from this. This way of painting with silicone, you have to create such subtle translucent layers that it's really hard to tell you've even put paint on the hand, but after hours of painstaking labor of love, it all comes together to look hyper realistic. So ultimately, I think it is a really cool skill to have, especially if you want to work in the industry, if you want to work in an FX studio, creating this kind of stuff for movies. Otherwise, if you're a beginner and you just want to watch it because you find it interesting, hopefully this will illuminate the process and the skill and time that goes into creating something like this. So this tutorial will go over how to cast the hand in silicone and how to fill that hand cast with more silicone, but properly releasing it so that the silicone doesn't bond to itself, which is what happened to me in my first run, and I had to completely restart the process. How to prep the silicone for painting, and how to paint the silicone in translucent washes and through an airbrush. So the first step is preparing the hand for the hand cast. David very nicely gave me a hand by giving me his hand to live cast. And you want to make sure that the silicone doesn't rip out all of the hairs on his hand and wrist, because that wouldn't be a very good way to say thank you. So the best way to do this is to use a self-releasing silicone which doesn't bond to hair. I do use a self-releasing silicone for my foot cast, but it hadn't arrived in the mail yet, so I went ahead and cast him with a silicone that doesn't self-release. I did try to prep the hand by putting Vaseline over it and over the hair near his wrist and forearm area, in the hopes that this would stop the silicone from ripping it out. But spoiler alert, it didn't. Some of his wrist hair did get ripped out in the process of removal, so I would recommend shaving the area if you can, just to make sure that the silicone comes off nicely and doesn't grip any of the hair. That is, if you can't get a self-releasing silicone. This is the kind of stuff you learn through doing it. Anyway, so I put a layer of Vaseline over his hand. You don't want the Vaseline too thick, as it can settle into the pores and creases and not give you the amount of detail that you want. Obviously, doing a hand cast is way faster than sculpting it, and you get a hyper-realistic mold that has all of the creases and pores and texture of a real human hand. So once you've got the Vaseline on and massaged in, you can start putting layers of silicone over the top to capture all of those details. I'm using a silicone called Pinkysil. It's by Barnes. They're an Australian company. Their self-releasing one is really good. It's called Oddbod. I would recommend that over this. If you're in the UK, I've heard good things about Mold Life's Lifeform body casting silicone. And if you're in the US, I've heard good things about Smooth On's Body Double Silk. So I've mixed up about 100 grams of Pinkysil silicone, and I've brushed it on using a cheap chip brush. This is going to be the detail coat, and then I'll put on a second thicker layer to help build up the thickness of the silicone so that it won't tear and so that it can kind of hold its own shape. To thicken my silicone, I've added something called GP20. You can also add other silicone thickening chemicals like Thixo, and you mix that into the Pinkysil silicone until it's thickened up, and then you can spread it over the hand like a paste. I did a third and final layer of thickened silicone just to go over any areas that I thought I had missed to make sure there was no weak spots. Next, I'm going to create a plaster bandage shell. This will go over the back and the front of the hand so that it will hold the hand exactly in shape, so that it will come out with no deformities or any warping, just to get the most accurate silicone version of David's hand. So I folded over my plaster bandage 2 or 3 times. I've dunked it into water for about 5 seconds, and then once it's come out of the water, I've squeezed as much of the water out of it as possible while rubbing it together to get the plaster thoroughly creamy and throughout all of the bandage. Then I place this over one half of David's hand. I do a couple of layers to make sure it covers all of it and is quite strong. So it is important to have a thick enough layer so that the plaster bandage doesn't fall apart, but do be aware that plaster bandage has an exothermic reaction. It heats up while it's setting, so even though David had 3 layers of silicone between his hand and the plaster bandage as a buffer, he could still feel the plaster bandage heating up, so you have to be aware of that to make sure it's not too thick or too hot, otherwise you can cause burns. Before we do the second half, the other side of the plaster bandages, I'm going to put a layer of Vaseline over that edge of the first plaster bandage half. Otherwise, when we overlap them, the 2 bandage halves will probably bond together and they won't come off David's hand just because it's a rigid material. But if we put a layer of Vaseline between them, this will be a release. It will stop the 2 halves from bonding, and then we can take apart the 2 halves and put them back together once the silicone has been removed from the hand. Now that it's released around the top, I'm going to start putting down that second half of plaster bandages, much in the same way we did the first half, putting down layers until there's a strong enough frame and really rubbing in those bandages together so that they make a strong half that doesn't separate. Now that the bandages have set, I'm going to carefully pry apart the edges of the bandage until it snaps apart and I can remove both halves safely. Now removing the silicone is a little bit trickier just because that silicone has bonded a little bit with the hairs on David's wrist, which is why it's easier to use a self-releasing silicone that comes off the hands or any body part really a lot easier. So David's getting this little wooden tool in underneath the silicone to help release the suction or the vacuum that the silicone has created, while wriggling his hand around in the inside to help break that suction as well until he can slide his hand out from the silicone. I just wanted to interject quickly and explain why I chose to body cast with silicone instead of alginate, especially considering that I had so many problems with my silicone body casting. The reason I picked silicone is because I wanted to cast multiple hands out of the same mold and then keep the mold for years to come if I ever need any severed hand molds for anything. But if you're wanting to just do one hand cast, then alginate is a much better option because it's way cheaper. You won't have any issues with the silicone bonding to it, and once it's set, you just rip it off and the hand comes out so much easier than it comes out of a silicone glove mold. And if you wanted to do multiple casts, like 2 or 3, it's probably still cheaper to use alginate. You just have to do the hand cast 3 times, so you have to have a patient model. And you can find tutorials about alginate live casting on Brick in the Yard's channel, so I'll link that. But anyway, I'll get back into my silicone body casting. Now to prepare the silicone mold to pour in my first silicone casting, I'm putting it back inside that plaster jacket that we made for it, and then putting it inside this box so that it will stay upright while we're pouring and while it's curing. There's a couple of different ways you can release silicone on silicone casting. A popular way is to dilute dishwashing liquid 50% with isopropyl alcohol. Ivory soap is a popular choice if you're in the US. In Australia, I've been using the Fairy brand. And you pour this mixture of isopropyl alcohol and dish soap into the silicone hand cast. You swirl it around to make sure it gets every part of that body cast, and then you pour it out and allow it to air dry. I repeat this 3 times. Another popular way to release silicone on silicone is to get some Vaseline and dilute the Vaseline into a liquid by adding in some lighter fluid, also known as naptha or Shellite. You do need to wear gloves and a mask while handling this because lighter fluid is dangerous. And then you pour this liquid Vaseline mixture into the silicone and allow it to coat everywhere, pour it out, allow it to dry, and then put in a second coating just in case it missed anywhere the first time. The Vaseline one is more foolproof for not having bonding, but I feel like it has the potential to accidentally clog up too much of the detail if the Vaseline is too thick, and you also have to work to remove that Vaseline coating on the silicone before you paint it, whereas the dish soap version is more likely to have a cleaner release, and you can add water down into the mold to help break it down as well, but there is a potential that you don't do it correctly and then your silicone bonds. The first time I ran my hand piece, it did bond, and when I pulled out the mold, 2 of the fingers snapped off and had completely bonded to the silicone mold on the inside, so I could no longer use the mold. It was unsalvageable, and the hand that I pulled out was fingerless, so I couldn't use that either, which resulted in an expensive waste of silicone and also a waste of time. And what I discovered is that I was pouring the silicone into my hand cast too quickly after I'd cast it, so I would recommend you wait a day or 2 before you release and pour your silicone. Now that my silicone hand cast is nicely released, I'm going to mix up the silicone that I'll be pouring into it. I'm using Platsil Gel 10 and I've deadened it 100%. So I pour in my Platsil Gel 10 part A, then I pour in my deadener, then I pour in my part B. Then I mix in my silicone pigment. I'm using the Pale Flesh Tone by Neill's Materials. And then I mix in my flocking. This is blue and red flocking by Mold Life. And then I give that a thorough stir to make sure all of the silicone at the bottom of the container is mixed in with everything else. Then I pour that from a high pour to try and minimize any air bubbles in the silicone, and then I slash that around inside the silicone cast. So this isn't enough to fill the hand, obviously, it's probably about half of the hand. I do this so that I can swirl it around inside the hand cast to get rid of any air bubbles, and also because I ran out of really big mixing cups. So then I mix and pour in the second batch of Platsil Gel 10 silicone. You can see that it's not fully filled up, there's a couple of centimeters gap. I did end up pushing in a little container that's about half the size of the wrist into that opening to make a hollow space where the hand goes onto the Christmas tree. But I did that closer towards the end of the curing time so that it wouldn't fully sink into the silicone hand. Now once that has cured, I'm going to take it out of the silicone mold. It does tear a little bit as I'm trying to open it, and I know some people just cut a straight line down the mold so that they can easily open it, and then they'll just patch that seam for future castings. But obviously it's easier if you don't have to patch it because you've got like a flawless glove mold that functions really well. So I push down little wooden sticks and things into the silicone so that it doesn't damage the silicone, but it does help to release that suction. And eventually, with enough patience and prodding and pulling, the silicone hand comes out of my silicone hand cast. The one I'm holding here is actually a second casting that I did in Platsil 7315, so it's a firmer silicone, and you can see in the background that's a Platsil Gel 10 version that's a bit softer, which is the one that I'm painting for this tutorial. And you can see here that the fingertips had a little bit of silicone bond in the mold. That was before I learned that I needed to leave my silicone overnight so that it wouldn't bond. So a tiny bit of the fingertips broke off, but it wasn't severe enough to have to restart the hand casting process from the beginning again. I could just patch these, so I used a little bit of Silpoxy, the silicone pigments, and some naphtha to patch the silicone hand. I'm not very good at silicone patching, so I'm not going to include it in this tutorial, but once I get good at it, I can show you how to do it. But hopefully if you follow my guidelines for releasing it and giving the mold time before you pour it in, you won't need to be patching your silicone hands.